Okay, I think we're going to go ahead and get started here. We're still waiting on a few people, but they'll be able to join us as we get underway here. I'd like to say welcome, everybody, to tonight's program. We're very happy you can all join us here on this slightly rainy, kind of overcast day, but it should be a very exciting program we have in store for all of you tonight. Tonight we have The Bonds of War, Lake County Soldiers in the American Civil War with author, curator, and historian Diana Dretske, who we're very, very happy to have with us tonight. I'd like to go over a couple different Zoom accessibility options before we get into our program tonight, just to make the viewing experience a little bit easier for everybody. If you look at your screen in the top right corner, there is a button that says View. If you go and click that and click on the speaker view, that'll change your screen automatically to whoever's speaking. It should make it a little bit easier to watch the program tonight. And then you can also click the full screen option, which will increase the picture for the program tonight, just make it a little bit easier to watch. We do ask that you please remain muted for the entire duration of the presentation, just to keep everything very clear audio-wise for our presenter. The last 15 minutes of the program will be devoted to a questions and answers segment with Diana Dretske. So we do ask that you hold all your questions until the very end of the program. At that point, we'll have 15 minutes where attendees can unmute themselves and ask Diana any questions that they have about her presentation. But if you do think of a question prior to that questions and answers point of the program, you can use the chat function down at the bottom of your screen to type in a question, and I will be reading those out for Diana once we enter that questions and answers portion of the presentation. I also want to note that this program is being recorded, and following the end of the presentation, it will be uploaded to our YouTube channel, which is youtube.com, and then just History Center, Lake Forest-Lake Bluff. And this recording will go onto YouTube this weekend after the program is completed. So with all that technical stuff out of the way, it is my pleasure to introduce tonight's guest speaker and give a little quick introduction as to the topic of tonight's program. Diana L. Dretske is the curator and Lake County historian for the Bess Bower Dunn Museum. Dretske has been researching the history of northeastern Illinois for over 30 years and received a Lifetime Achievement Award from the Illinois State Historical Society for her outstanding contributions in promoting, preserving, and commemorating Illinois history. Tonight, Diana Dretske will present on her recently published book with Southern Illinois University Press, The Bonds of War, a collective biography of 5 immigrants from Britain and Ireland who served with the 96th Illinois Infantry during the American Civil War. The presentation will include her work to identify a photo portrait of these men in the collections of the Bess Bower Dunn Museum, which led her to research their lives in Lake County, the significance of their voluntary military service, and their desire to be recognized as American citizens. So with that, I'd like to turn it over to tonight's very special guest speaker, Diana Dretske. Diana, the floor is yours.
Great, thank you. Thanks for inviting me. It's really my pleasure to be speaking with you this evening. And well, let's get into things. In the second year of the American Civil War, the men in this image commemorated their commitment to fight for the preservation of the United States in a photographic portrait that inspired my book, The Bonds of War. I took on this research actually outside of my day job at the museum, visiting archives throughout Illinois and beyond, and even met with some of the men's descendants. It would take me 6 years to complete this book. And my screen does not want to advance. There we go. The events of the Civil War and its aftermath remain relevant to this day, and historians continue to make discoveries in archives that prompt new research and insights into the war. that was the case for me with this photo tintype of 5 Union soldiers in the collections of the Bess Bower Dunn Museum, where I am a curator. The donor had only identified his grandfather, Scottish-born Edward Murray, who had enlisted from Lake County in Company C of the 96th Illinois Volunteer Infantry. Murray is pictured on the bottom right in the portrait. Within the span of just 2 generations, the connection between the donor's grandfather and the other men had been lost. Imagine my disappointment when I realized that only one of the 5 men was identified. Without their names, their contributions to the Civil War were lost, and I was compelled to recover each man's identity. I utilized multiple sources, including historic maps, census records, the regimental history published in 1887, and Edward Murray's war reminiscences to help me identify the other men in the portrait. The men were James Murray and John Taylor from Scotland, William Lewin from England, and Laughlin Madden from Ireland. So I put up this antique map of Britain and Ireland with their names on it to give you a sense where they live. None of these men actually were related, and none of their families knew each other before they came to the United States. With their names, other details were revealed. I had known that Edward Murray was born in Scotland, but since the majority of the 96th Illinois Volunteers were American born, I had made the assumption that some of these men would also be Americans. I did not anticipate that the men were all immigrants from Britain and Ireland. So as you can see, historic maps are a great resource and an important component of understanding the men's origins and even to their motivations of why they enlisted in the Union Army. All were children when their families left behind these countries where privilege and monarchy ruled. This portrait is evidence that immigrants wholeheartedly responded to the call to arms and offers us a new perspective on who was enlisting in the Union Army. Without immigrants and sons of immigrants, who made up an estimated 43% of the North's armed forces during the war, the Union could not have won. And yet stories of immigrant soldiers are largely untold. This 1861 map of Lake County shows a partial view of Newport Township, where the men settled between 1841 and 1854. Each of the men settled within less than 1 mile of each other on the Stateline Road near today's Russell, Illinois. So I put some markers on the map to give you a little reference points. You see Route 173 towards the bottom of the map. So this was north of Wadsworth, if you know where Wadsworth is. And Russell Road that you see at the top of the map is also known as Stateline Road, kind of interchanges. The squiggly line down the middle, that's the Des Plaines River, and that's where today's Russell, Illinois is located, the little hamlet. So the stars represent where each of these men settled. And just quickly, it's probably a little hard for you to see, so that's why I did the different colors. So the green star on your left is for Laughlin Madden, who was from Ireland, and that part of Newport Township actually was called Irish Hills because it was largely inhabited by Irish settlers, and it came to be known that. At the top of the map, the blue star there is where Edward Murray and his family settled, right on the state line. His house is still there today. Then a little lower to the right, the lighter blue, was where John Taylor worked as a farmer. And at the time when, a lot of times when you worked for other farmers, you would live there as well. So he lived there with the John Murray family. The purple star on the right is where James Murray lived. So John Murray was his uncle. And so James Murray's family lived on the other side of the river. And the pink star down in the middle there was where Billy Lewin lived. The 3 stars in the middle, also for more perspective for you, is the location of today's Van Patten Woods Forest Preserve. So if you're ever up there and walking around along the Des Plaines River, you're walking on the farmland where these men lived and worked. I was interested in how they formed their bond former to the outbreak of the Civil War. Proximity as neighbors was definitely a factor in their interactions, and also shared experiences as immigrants and farmers, seeing one another at local gatherings and also church meetings. The majority of their neighbors were from New England and New York, but this was definitely at this time in the county's history, this was a very sparsely populated area. People were inclined to help each other in any way they could. Most of these men had lived in the United States for less than 10 years when the Confederacy fired on the US garrison at Fort Sumter on April 12, 1861. This headline from the Kenosha Times in Wisconsin exemplifies the patriotism that was felt at the start of the war. The wording was meant to reach all men, citizens, freemen, and citizens with American hearts. And that was certainly intended for immigrant men who loved their adopted country. The rush of patriotism in the North united Native and foreign-born Americans in the excitement. Dozens of men throughout Lake County enlisted that first year of the war. But the feeling in the Stateline Road community and throughout the nation was that the war would be over quickly and only a few men were needed to fill the roles. For this reason, Edward Murray and many of his neighbors did not enlist in 1861, although they wholeheartedly supported the fight against secessionists. It was during the second summer of the war that the Union's cause became more desperate, with the failure of McClellan's Peninsula campaign to capture Richmond, Virginia. President Lincoln's call for 600,000 troops forced communities to meet larger quotas for enlistees. And this was something that was actually published in the Waukegan paper. They would list each township and how many men were liable for duty and what the actual quota was. So the quota was a percentage of how many men were of the right age to enlist. So this is how they knew how many people men they needed to get for the roles. It was clear that many more Illinoisans were needed in the Western theater where they could strike at the core of the Confederacy. On August 1st, 1862, Edward Murray was in his harvest field when John Pollock came to call. Pollock was a well-known farmer and horse breeder from the Milburn community, and he became a key recruiter for a company of men in what would become Company C of the 96th Illinois. And the photo here you're seeing is Edward Murray's farm there on Stateline Road, and his house is still standing today. After Murray signed Pollock's list, Pollock walked across the road and enlisted John Taylor and his brother James, who were working for the Murray family on their farm. So they were farm laborers there. Billy Lewin, Laughlin Madden, and James Murray were recruited 2 weeks later by Pollock. Pollock's recruits consisted of 42% foreign-born volunteers. This was the third largest group of immigrants in the 96 Illinois. While I found evidence that some of the men had strong feelings about the immorality of slavery, or like Edward Murray, who had abolitionist leanings, it does not appear that that was the motivation for them to enlist. One thread that resonated with these men and also other immigrant soldiers was the hope that military service would prove their Americanness. For James Murray, his reason was patriotism and love of country forced him to abandon the plow. However, as the war progressed, the abolishment of slavery became a key force in their fight to save the country. The 5 men met at Murray's home, as you see here, and on September 2nd, they went together to Waukegan to begin drilling with the 96 Illinois. So these men were actually mentioned in Murray's war reminiscences, and they gathered at his home and then headed down to Waukegan together to start their journey. So they spent several days in Waukegan, starting to drill, starting to learn some of those military things that they needed to know. They were all farmers, so they didn't know any of that. And after several days, the 96 Illinois, the Lake County companies that were all there in Waukegan, left from the depot and took a train to Camp Fuller in Rockford. The 96 was a joint venture between Lake and Joe Daviess counties, since neither county had enough men to form its own regiment. So a regiment was 10 companies, and each company was 100 men, or as close to that as you could recruit. And so Lake County was able to recruit enough for 4 companies and Joe Daviess 6 companies, and they made an arrangement to join together. When the men arrived at Camp Fuller in Rockford, it was the first time they met the companies from Joe Daviess County. Joe Daviess County, the main city there is Galena. Also training at Camp Fuller were the 74th, 92nd, and 95th Illinois. And Camp Fuller had just been created the month before for the purpose of training the troops during the Civil War. At Camp Fuller, the regiment drilled for hours each day. Edward Murray called it the most tiring work I ever did, yet there was something inspiring and grand to see and be one of 1,000, all in uniform, marching with drums beating and flags flying. So you can imagine yourself as an immigrant and as a farmer, and you enlist in this war that you believe in, and you go to Camp Fuller, where you meet 1,000 other men, and you're given uniforms and you're training, and there's a lot of excitement going on, a lot of different emotions are happening. This commemorative portrait was taken at Camp Fuller to mark their personal bonds and service as American soldiers. I feel that their patriotic enthusiasm and pride in their Union blue uniforms is evident in the portrait. And the emblem you see on the right was they were given hardy hats, which were the tall hats, and there would have an emblem on the front of it, and that's one of them there that would be sewn to the front with the regimental number. Two of the 96 Illinois volunteers were Henry P. Ostrander and his son Henry from Shields Township. You can see their property here on the 1861 map, and I have some arrows and street names there for you to orient. The Ostrander property was on the northeast corner of Green Bay Road and Laughlin Road in today's Lake Bluff. The yellow star is where the property was. The father and son enlisted together in Company C of the 96. In 1854, when the Northwestern Railway was under construction, Ostrander built a tavern and boarded the workers from the railroad there. So he had room and board for them. He was also a cooper and a farmer and ran a mail wagon between Libertyville and his house, so very entrepreneurial. While in training at Camp Fuller with the regiment, son Henry contracted typhoid fever. He was permitted to go home to convalesce, but he died at home on October 13th, 1862, just a little over a month since enlisting. He was the first death in the regiment. His father remained with the regiment, and really he didn't have a choice since he was sworn in to serve the Army. So he remained with the regiment and served with the 96 as a wagon master until mustering out in January 1864. Actually, he was discharged for disability in 1864. So his health was not good at that point. Another Shields Township man who enlisted with the 96 was William Laughlin of Lake Forest. He was another key recruiter for the 96 Illinois for Company C specifically. At the organization of the regiment, he was elected as second lieutenant, and within less than a year, he was promoted to first lieutenant. So a lot of these volunteer regiments that were formed, the 96 in particular, elected their officers. They actually voted on it. When the 96 was at Brentwood, Tennessee in April 1863, Laughlin was one of 20 men from the regiment, along with men from the 78th and 92nd Illinois, who were selected for the newly formed Pioneer Brigade. The Pioneer Corps was established by Major General William Rosecrans. This select group of soldiers performed tool work, repaired roads, built small bridges, and even supervised construction of fortifications. Although pioneers had long been part of the American Army, Rosecrans understood the need for a special brigade due to the demands of fighting in the Western Theater, where the Army's supply lines often stretched for hundreds of miles through the terrain. In fact, the 96 Illinois spent a lot of its time guarding these long wagon trains that had all of their supplies and extra ammunition and everything in them. You may wonder why Laughlin was asked to be a part of this group and was chosen to be, because he was already a contractor, a master builder. Laughlin was put in command of Company B of the Pioneers and immediately assigned to the construction of Fort Granger. Fort Granger was located on the right bank of the Harpeth River near Franklin, Tennessee. One advantage of this location for the men of the 96 is that when they were not on picket duty or guarding prisoners, they could enjoy the river. John Taylor remarked that they had a jolly old time bathing and diving into the river. This was actually really good for the men to have some way to have a bit of fun, but it also gave them the opportunity to wash their clothes, bathe and wash their clothes. And that was something when you were on the march all the time, you didn't have an opportunity for. So that was good for their hygiene. In November 1865, Laughlin mustered out as a major in command of Companies A and F of the Pioneer Corps. He returned to Lake Forest and continued working in construction and then moved to Cook County. As the men marched off to war, important to their success was to retain a strong connection to home and to know that their families and neighbors supported them and would not forget them. Susie Smith of Milburn was a great correspondent to her brother George and his tent mates who had enlisted in the 96th. Letters brought comfort and gave men the strength to face the hardships of a soldier's life. George's comrades were actually envious of Susie's frequent and well-written letters. He wrote to her that the boys in the tent all said that your letter beat all the letters they ever heard and that thought it ought to be printed. Susie did love to read and write. In fact, she even wrote poetry, and she was a local one-room school teacher. She was also a founding member of the Milburn Literary Association. She bolstered support for the war by keeping families and soldiers connected through the society's pro-union paper named the Milburn Union Casket for treasures it held inside its pages. And that's what you're seeing on the right-hand side of the screen is one of the front pages from the Milburn Union Casket. This handwritten paper included original poetry and excerpts from soldiers' letters. And they took subscriptions, and part of the subscription price was, I don't remember how many pennies it was, but if you paid a couple of pennies more, they would include the ribbon so that you could bind the pages together with a ribbon provided with your subscription. Charlotte Gallagher Smith of Galena was the wife of brevetted Colonel John C. Smith of the 96th. It was common for the wives and family of officers to visit them in camp, and Charlotte and her sons began those visits while the regiment was at Camp Fuller in Rockford. And they continued to visit the regiment when they were in the Western Theater. Her presence brought a bit of home to their lives and eased the men's homesickness. If you can imagine also these men being removed from the comforts of home and their families. And at this time in the 1800s, the men really relied on the women of the family to do all those things for them, to mend their clothes, wash the clothes, cook the meals. If they were sick, the women often had their own remedies for caring for them. And so all of a sudden that was all gone, and you're just out there with thousands of men, and you're kind of on your own, really, especially at the beginning of the war when there wasn't, the hospital system hadn't been created and hadn't gotten up to speed yet. In 1863, following the Battle of Chickamauga, Charlotte cared for the sick and wounded in hospitals in Nashville. Charlotte Smith referred to the men of the 96 as her soldier children and cared for their well-being as if they were her own sons. She came to be known by the men as the mother of the regiment. When she was in camp, it was felt she represented every soldier's mother. And they appreciated her so much that they included her portrait in the regimental history. It was actually a year into the regiment's service before they had their first battle. And that first battle was at Chickamauga, Georgia in September 1863. Up until that point, the regiment had spent most of its time on picket duty, guarding prisoners, chopping wood, building fortifications. And they had gotten to the point where they really felt that the only way you could show your worth was to fight, and they hadn't fought yet. So they were really itching for that. So this would be the regiment's single most important engagement of the war. The regiment's historian, Charles Partridge, wrote, "Though long years have passed since the name Chickamauga was hurled into history, the hand trembles and the pen falters as the word is written." The men of the 96 were well trained. They did a lot of drilling every day, but they were also green and spoiling for a fight. It was the hope of many of the foreign-born men that wartime service would gain them improved social status and acceptance. And fighting rather than digging fortifications was considered the best way to show their worth. As part of the Army of the Cumberland, they were anxious to be of use to Major General William Rosecrans against Confederate General Braxton Bragg. The 96 was part of Gordon Granger's Reserve Corps and was among the troops sent to support General George Thomas, Major General George Thomas. On September 20th, the men were marched on the Double Quick for about 2 hours. When they arrived at Snodgrass House to support General Thomas, they barely had time to wipe the sweat from their brows before they were ordered to fight on Horseshoe Ridge. General Granger said to Thomas, "They are raw troops and they don't know any better than to charge up there." So you can imagine the flurry of that day, and they're coming across the fields, and as they were marching on the Double Quick, they did come across dead bodies and were fired upon. And then they arrive there and barely have a chance to catch their breaths, and they're on the move again. Edward Murray recalled that at Chickamauga in the charge at Horseshoe Ridge, some of the men were hit, but we did not stop until we got to the top of the rise when we were ordered to fire at will. And a rebel battery and infantry were right in front of them, and they poured galling fire into our ranks. Murray was struck by a mini ball near the right side of the spine, which paralyzed his lower limbs and rendered him helpless on the battlefield. William Lewin tried to carry Murray off the field, but Murray was like a dead weight. And as the rebel line approached, Murray told Lewin, "Billy, run, I am all right." The 96th Illinois fought till half their men were slain at Chickamauga, but the Union Army lost that battle, and its dead and wounded were left on the field, including Murray. So if you lost, you also lost control of the field. Murray recalled, "That was a night stamped on my memory that can never be erased. I lay there perfectly helpless with my thoughts centered on my faraway home and my loved ones and how or when or if I should ever see them." Chickamauga was by far the deadliest battle fought in the West. It was second only to Gettysburg in the number of lives lost during the entire war. And the 96th Lieutenant Colonel Isaac Clark was killed at this battle. So I think Chickamauga is overlooked quite a bit because it was just a few months before that Gettysburg happened. And of course, that was a Union victory, but also the number of losses was pretty overwhelming to people. But also Chickamauga was a Union loss. So I think that's why it isn't talked about so much. At Chickamauga, General Rosecrans' army suffered a staggering 16,215 casualties. The Confederates actually had more casualties, 18,454. And their dead and wounded were intermingled with the Northern soldiers on the field after the battle. So moments after Billy Lewin ran from Edward Murray's side on the battlefield, Lewin was grazed by a bullet, slightly cutting his head and plowing a deep furrow about 10 inches in length along his back. It disabled him for the remainder of the battle, and he had to find his way on his own back to field hospital to get treated. Murray, who was left paralyzed on the battlefield in the hands of the enemy, was actually on the battlefield for 10 days before being exchanged into Union lines and taken to a hospital. During that time, the only thing that saved him was that there was an old woman who had a house that happened to be in the middle of the battle. And when the Confederates started collecting the wounded and gathering them, Murray was carried to this house where there were other wounded Union soldiers. And she took pity on him. She had some chicken broth and she would bring him out a little pint of chicken broth to eat each day. And if not for that, he felt he would have died, and likely so, 10 days with nothing else. He later recalled that as he lay on the ground, he had time to think of his home and his loved ones and if he should ever see them again. So you can imagine being that helpless and coming all the way down there. In fact, he said the woman asked him, you know, why have you come down here? And he kind of wondered that himself at that moment. Murray's brother came to get him. Once Murray was taken back into Union lines in the hospital, Murray's brother came down from Lake County and took him home to convalesce. He eventually received a discharge for disability, but he never regained full use of his legs. John Taylor, at the Battle of Chickamauga, was shot in the wrist in the first charge on Horseshoe Ridge. He walked back to the field hospital and eventually made it to a hospital in Nashville, but he did not survive. John's siblings were unable to overcome the emotional and financial strain of bringing his body home to Lake County to be buried. After the creation of the Nashville National Cemetery in 1866, Taylor's remains were reburied there. Laughlin Madden survived the Battle of Chickamauga without injury, but was captured while on picket duty days later on Missionary Ridge. He died at Andersonville and is buried there. And Andersonville is located, it's a rebel prison located in Georgia. James Murray was actually not at the Battle of Chickamauga with his comrades. He had gotten ill with one of those chronic intestinal illnesses that the soldiers suffered from, and he had been hospitalized prior to the battle. He was the only one of the 5 men who remained with their regiment during its entire service from start to finish, and he mustered out with the regiment in June 1865. After the war, Edward Murray, Billy Lewin, and James Murray were active in veterans organizations for the remainder of their lives. Each of these men are buried in Newport Township at Mount Rest Cemetery. Solving the mystery of the unidentified men in this portrait was really just the beginning of my journey that ultimately revealed a unique story of immigrants who settled in Lake County as farmers and why they chose to fight to save the United States at so critical a time in the nation's history. John Taylor and Laughlin Madden died for that cause, and Edward Murray, Billy Lewin, and James Murray struggled for the rest of their lives with disability and haunted memories. Like many immigrant soldiers, these men sought gratitude for their service, and the greatest prize of all was to be accepted as an American. From a letter written to his sister in May 1863, John Taylor expresses it best. As the boys say, if we do not get our chunk wiped out by the rebels, we will probably live to be respected and acknowledged as good American citizens. Hope so. Through these men, we can better understand the motivations of immigrants who, as ordinary citizens, embraced America's ideals of freedom and liberty and represented Illinois and Lake County in the fight to preserve the Union. Thank you.
Thank you so much for that incredible presentation, Diana. So we do have a few minutes for questions and answers. If anybody has any questions for Diana, you can go ahead and unmute yourself now if you want to ask it directly, or you can type it into the chat function.
We covered a lot of ground, so it might be a little bit to process.
Yeah, this is Chris here. I have a question. How many of the regiment returned back to Illinois at the end of the war? Originally were recruited back in 1862. Who was left at the end after death and disease and whatnot?
Right. Well, after Chickamauga, they only had in Company C, which started out, I think, with 98 men. They only had 22 left that were, well enough to serve. And so just the Company C itself was really obliterated. The 96 Illinois had the third highest death rate casualties at Chickamauga. I don't remember how many returned home, but their numbers were greatly decimated after Chickamauga.
Was that their only battle they experienced? No,
they were also in the Atlanta campaign and the Nashville campaign. So yeah, and the Atlanta campaign, there were battles in that, of course.
So they were with Sherman then.
Yes,
Yeah, okay.
yes. And but was one of the things that was so hard about the Atlanta campaign for all of the soldiers was that it never let up. And there was constantly fighting going on. So they never really had a reprieve the whole time. So it was really exhausting for the men, but ultimately they were victorious.
And did they get more recruits during the war, or it was just a dwindling number of men month by month, year by year?
Yeah, so all the regiments did this. They would constantly go back and have people back at home trying to recruit more people. In fact, when they were in Kentucky towards the beginning of the war, they actually recruited 2 rebel deserters into Company C, and kind of unusual. And the other companies in the regiment really were not happy that they had done that. The 2 guys ended up being good soldiers, although John Taylor's brother got into a fight with one of them. So I think there was some tension there. But yeah, no, they would go back. They would have people back home who would
From Lake County.
recruits. From Lake County. Mm-hmm.
Okay, thank you.
Welcome.
Thank you for that, Chris. Looks like we have another question in the chat here from Richard Thompson. Asks, what brought these men to Lake County in the first place?
Well, for John Taylor, the answer is his older sister had already immigrated several years before that. There was just a wave of immigration from Scotland. A lot of people, went to Australia. A lot of people went to the United States and Canada. And when the West, which we were at that point, opened up with the Erie Canal, and after the final treaties with indigenous people, that opened this area to more settlement. So then the wave pushed that way. So his sister had already come over with some of their cousins and settled in Milburn, up north here. And then actually Edward Murray's family first settled in New York State. They were in Glasgow, Scotland, and worked in the textile industry. And so his father thought Glasgow, Scotland it was hundreds of thousands of people lived there. It was a huge city even at that time. So he really wanted to get out of those conditions and go to America like everyone was doing. So we have to remember, that was a beacon for a lot of people to get away from, economic issues and things that were happening in the British Isles. So they went to New York State because they knew that there were textile factories there. And they worked there. They immigrated in 1834 and they stayed there until 1841. So by then, this area had opened up to settlement. And so his father said, we're not going to work in the mills anymore. I'm going to buy land and we're going to farm it. And there's actually a lot of those stories here in Lake County of people coming west and giving up work in the textile mills. Another example, Laughlin Madden, who's from Ireland, his family was escaping the famine, the potato famine. So they were escaping death, and they were also escaping oppression. And they were Irish Catholics, so they had religious and political oppression. So they had a huge impetus for leaving. They initially settled in Kenosha County, and then I'm sure through the grapevine, heard about Irish Hills, where there were a lot of Irish settlers coming. So a lot of times there were things in newspapers, there was word of mouth, people went on ahead, all those things. There was ways of hearing about things, but the great impetus once you were here to come to Lake County was because it was newly opened and there was a lot of land for sale. So opportunity.
Fascinating. One thing that I was curious about, Diana, after listening to your presentation here was, I know it's a very common topic to think about how European immigrants were perceived during the 20th century. Particularly, you mentioned how these British and Irish immigrants sought nothing but to be recognized for their patriotism and to be seen as true Americans. A question that I had for you while you were conducting this research was, did you find any information as to whether or not these British or Irish immigrants who were enlisted, do they become more and more American inside the military circles through their heroism and actions within conflicts like Chickamauga or any other kind of conflicts? Did they start to become recognized during the Civil War itself as patriots, as heroes?
Yeah, it's a really complex question. There's a lot of ways to answer that. One is actually just by these men choosing to enlist with the 96th Illinois, they were making a decision to fight alongside their American-born neighbors. There were ethnic regiments they could have enlisted in. There was a Scotch regiment, there was the Irish Brigade, so they could have made that choice, but they chose to enlist with their neighbors who were Americans, and that was part of that movement towards assimilating, shall we say, and having a bond with those people. They felt comfortable enough with their neighbors that they wanted to fight alongside with them. So it says a lot for the community that they had already built before the war broke out. I think the Irish and the Germans had the most problems. The Germans with the language were often discriminated against because of that. And there's a lot of debate about how much that actually helps them, and if American born soldiers were as welcoming to them or not. So I've read a lot of different things, but I tried just to focus on these 5 guys. So yeah, I think it did make them more American, and it did assimilate them more, and how could it not bond you even more closely to your neighbors when you're fighting shoulder to shoulder with them?
Diana, this is Jerry. As I recall, at one time there was a monument at the courthouse, a statue of Civil War soldier. Do you know if that's still there?
Yes. Hi, Jerry.
Hi.
We used to work together. Yeah. So the men here who survived, Edward Murray, Billy Lewin, and James Murray, were all part of the veterans who worked tirelessly for over 3 decades to get a Civil War monument built in Waukegan. And the monument was dedicated to the Civil War dead. A lot of Civil War monuments are dedicated just to the soldiers who fought in general, but theirs specifically was to honor their dead. That was finally, they got enough funding and support for it, and that was built in 1899 on the courthouse square, and it is still there. It had been moved 50 years ago, a little bit to the left, shall we say, when the new courthouse was built. But if you go to Waukegan, you can see that Lake County Civil War Monument on County Street. It's on the east side of the county building. And on the west side of the county building is a monument to Abraham Lincoln. So yeah, it's still there. It's very, very impressive.
Wonderful. We could take a couple more minutes here in case anyone has to type out any final questions or has any final comments here. But I want to thank everybody for attending tonight's program. Diana, I want to give you a special thank you for all your work and for taking the time to come here and to talk a little about your publication, which is available at Southern Illinois University Press, which I've just added a link to into the chat here. While we kind of wait for a couple other questions to come in from anybody who does have any, I wanted to talk a little bit about some upcoming programs we have at the History Center Lake Forest-Lake Bluff. On April 7th, Thursday, April 7th at 7 p.m., we're very excited to market our History of Women's Health and Women's Board program, which will be in person. We're very excited for that, to get back into some in-person programming at the History Center, commemorating the 75th anniversary of the Women's Board at Northwestern Medicine Lake Forest Hospital. Saturday, April 16th, just a week after that, we have our 4th iteration of Little Historians, which is our story time segment that we have for children ages 5 to 9 years old. So if you know any aspiring historians, you can reference them over to that program. It's going to be very exciting. And then as the season progresses, we are starting to get back into our tours that we offer at the History Center. On April 21st, one of our incredible docents, Sandra Stringer, is going to be giving a tour of historic Market Square in downtown Lake Forest. And then also on May 7th, Saturday, May 7th, we have our annual very special tour of the Crabtree Farm in Lake Bluff. And they offer 2 times for that tour, both on May 7th, 10 a.m. and 1 p.m. And that's an incredible tour, very exclusive, an incredibly picturesque location in Lake Bluff. And so if any of those sound interesting, you can head over to the History Center Lake Forest-Lake Bluff main website, which I will include a link to in the chat here. There we go. So if any of those programs or tours sound interesting, go ahead and check out those. All programming and registration information is available there. Once again, this program has been recorded and will be made available on YouTube, hopefully this weekend, probably Saturday or Sunday. Keep an eye out for it. So that's youtube.com/History Center Lake Forest-Lake Bluff, or you can just type in History Center Lake Forest-Lake Bluff into the search bar and it should come up there. So once again, Diana, thank you immensely for your incredible presentation and for sharing this with all of us tonight.
Thank you. Appreciate the invitation.
And I'd like to thank all of you for attending this program tonight. From us at the History Center, we wish you all a very good night, and until next time.